I wanted to show you how you use the Porter model to determine your company's generic strategy. We're going to be using the generic strategy for several assignments in this class, so it's really important to get it right. Every company has to be cost competitive and has to differentiate itself in some way. But the idea of the generic strategy is to determine whether the company primarily focuses on low cost versus high cost and primarily has a broad market versus a narrow market. A company can't be both low cost and high cost at the same time and can't be both a broad market and a narrow market at the same time. So with the generic strategy, we have to pick one of these three categories. So the way to figure it out for your company is to look at whether they're primarily emphasizing low cost or high cost. A company with a low cost strategy focuses on low prices. A company with a high cost strategy can typically command a higher price for its product because it's different enough from the competition. In addition to looking at the cost strategy, we need to look at the competitive scope. Broad market means a very broad customer base and typically a very broad product line. Narrow market means the company focuses on a market niche and typically has a smaller product line. So if we take a look at the example from the book, Walmart, with their slogan, "Everyday Low Prices," is the example always given for low cost. They're also a broad market. They're the largest retailer in the US, and they sell everything at their superstores from groceries to clothing to household items. Neiman Marcus is a high-end department store. They can command a premium price for their products. They're a broad market with many different departments: jewelry, shoes, clothing, etc. When we look at narrow market, Payless Shoes is an example. They focus on cost-conscious consumers. Their product line is primarily shoes. Tiffany & Company is focused on the big spenders, the high-end customers, and their product line is primarily just jewelry. When you're trying to figure out the strategy for your company may not be as low cost as Walmart because they're at one extreme, but you need to figure out whether they fall into more of the low cost versus high cost category. Discount stores, for instance, would fall into the low cost category, even if they aren't as inexpensive as Walmart. When we're looking at multinational companies, by definition, they fall into the broad market category. You don't get to be a global company by focusing on a specific niche. On the other hand, regional companies or companies that just focus on one type of product would fall into the narrow market category. If you're trying to figure out what category your company falls into, if they have a slogan like Walmart, "Everyday Low Prices," that can be a clue. If they don't and you're still struggling, a good place to look for their strategy is in their annual report. Their annual report is typically found under the investor category on their website, or in some cases you can Google it. I looked at the annual report for Tiffany's before they were bought out, and before they were bought out, their annual revenue was about $4 billion. That may not sound that narrow to you, but in the grand scheme of things, where multi-billion-dollar companies fall into the broad market. They fall into the narrow market. Another clue that they are narrower than the broad market companies is the fact that they were bought out by a bigger company. So when you're looking at your generic strategy, figure out which category is the best fit. If their annual report and their slogan doesn't help you, you might also think about their competitors. If their competitors are clearly in one of these categories, that can be indicative of, not absolute, but can give you a clue as to what category the company falls into. And as I mentioned, it's important to get the generic strategy right because we'll be using it in many assignments in this class.